She was left with a baby and no money. Now she's a powerful judge making him face justice. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Maria's world shattered like glass the day David left her. They had married young, driven by the intoxicating thrill of first love and the belief that they could conquer anything together. When they discovered Maria was pregnant, she thought it would only bring them closer, cementing their bond. But David's reaction was far from what she had imagined. He seemed distant, spending more time at work and less with her. Then came the day she could never forget. David packed his bags without a word, leaving only a cold, emotionless note behind. "I can't do this anymore." In one swift move, he emptied their joint accounts, leaving Maria with a newborn and a pile of unpaid bills. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the absolute indifference with which he'd walked away, leaving her to face the chaos he created. The first few months after David left were an unending nightmare. Maria had to sell their modest house and move into a dingy one-bedroom apartment. She picked up odd jobs, waitressing, babysitting, cleaning houses, anything to make ends meet. All the while, she cared for baby Lucas, her only source of strength amidst the wreckage of her former life. Nights were sleepless, filled with the cries of a hungry baby and the hum of her mind racing through worries about the next meal, the next rent payment, the next crisis. But Maria refused to crumble. She realized that she couldn't depend on anyone else, especially not David. It was then that she made a promise to herself. She would become someone Lucas could look up to, someone who didn't give in to despair. She enrolled in night school, scraping together enough to study for the LSATs. She would become a lawyer, she decided, no matter how long it took. It wasn't just about the career. It was about reclaiming her dignity and proving to herself that she could stand on her own. Her journey through law school was a trial of endurance. She worked 2 jobs during the day and studied into the early hours of the morning, reading legal texts with one hand while rocking Lucas to sleep with the other. Her classmates saw her as quiet and serious, but none of them knew the mountain she was climbing in the shadows. While they celebrated weekend parties, she celebrated small victories. An A on a paper, finding a cheaper babysitter, making it through another week without collapsing. Despite the hardships, Maria thrived in her studies, discovering a sharp mind for the intricacies of the law. Professors were impressed by her insights, and soon, she found herself interning at a prestigious law firm. It was here that she realized her true calling wasn't just to become a lawyer but to ascend to the ranks of judgeship, where she could make a real difference. When she finally passed the bar exam, it felt like a dream, a distant goal now made real through sheer determination. But Maria's success wasn't just hers. It belonged to Lucas too. He had been there through every late-night study session, every exhaustion-filled morning. As Maria's career took off, she made sure to be present for Lucas, showing him that they were in this together. She built a life that was modest but filled with love and security, a far cry from the uncertainty that had defined their first years alone. A decade passed, and Maria's dedication and integrity propelled her to the bench, becoming a family court judge known for her fair but firm rulings. Her reputation grew, and she became a pillar of the legal community, a sharp, compassionate mind who never forgot the struggles of those who came before her bench. She thought she had moved past David's betrayal, that the scars had faded with time. Yet fate had other plans. One morning, Maria's life took an unexpected turn when she saw a familiar name on the court docket: David West. He was facing charges for money laundering and fraud, his once successful business empire now crumbling. Maria's hands trembled as she read the case file, her mind flashing back to those nights of uncertainty and fear, when she had no one to rely on but herself. She hadn't heard from David in years, and now he was in trouble. Serious trouble. As she prepared for the trial, Maria wrestled with a storm of emotions. Part of her felt a grim satisfaction at seeing him brought low, but another part questioned whether she could truly be impartial. Could she judge the man who had abandoned her with their newborn child? She knew that the courtroom demanded fairness, that she must separate the past from the present. But deep down, she understood that this trial could never be just another case. It was a reckoning, a collision of their two worlds, one shaped by struggle, the other by a downfall of his own making. The first day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. David walked in, his once confident swagger now reduced to a nervous shuffle. He looked older, wearier, a shadow of the man who had left her. When his eyes met Maria's on the bench, a flicker of shock crossed his face, quickly masked by a forced, polite smile. He hadn't known that she was the judge. But Maria didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a steely resolve that told him she was no longer the woman he had left behind. As the trial began, Maria listened intently, her expression unreadable as the prosecution laid out their case. David's business had been built on shaky foundations, skirting regulations, hiding profits, laundering money through shell companies. The evidence was damning, but David's defense team tried to paint him as a victim of bad advice, a once successful entrepreneur led astray by corrupt partners. Maria remained silent, her gavel in hand, but inside she was unraveling the layers of the story, piecing together how David had fallen so far. And through it all, she kept a secret smile, knowing that David had no idea just how much power she held over his fate now. Yet, she also knew that the real challenge was yet to come, that the greatest test would be whether she could wield that power without letting bitterness guide her hand. The courtroom drama unfolded, tension mounting with every witness, every piece of evidence. Yet, beneath the surface, an unspoken story was brewing, one that only Maria understood. She would give David the fair trial he never deserved to deny her. But justice had a way of balancing the scales, and Maria was ready to see it through to the end, no matter where the gavel fell. The second day of the trial dawned overcast, the gray skies mirroring the tension that simmered in the courtroom. The media buzzed with interest. David West's case was big news, but the real story was the judge presiding over it, a woman who had once been a nobody, now holding the fate of a former business magnate in her hands. Maria kept her face calm, her emotions tightly controlled, as she navigated the procedural complexities of the case. Yet, inside she could feel the weight of every moment. David's lawyers pushed hard, painting a picture of a man who had simply made mistakes, of a businessman who had trusted the wrong people. They brought in witnesses who spoke of David's supposed integrity, emphasizing how he had been misled by his own employees. But the prosecution was relentless, presenting a trail of evidence that tied David directly to the laundering scheme, showing that he wasn't just complicit. He had masterminded it. As each witness took the stand, Maria scrutinized their words, searching for the truth amid the legal maneuvering. David sat at the defense table, his expression a mask of desperation, occasionally glancing at Maria as if hoping for some sign of sympathy. But Maria offered none, maintaining her professional distance. Inside, she remembered the cold emptiness of the apartment she'd moved into after he left, the struggle of keeping Lucas fed and warm. There would be no sympathy from her, not now. Then came the day when David took the stand in his own defense. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, glancing nervously around before speaking. He portrayed himself as a man who had been pressured into unethical choices, claiming that he had no idea the extent of the illegal activities under his company's roof. Maria listened without a trace of emotion on her face, but her mind was a whirlwind of memories. Of David's charm, his confidence, and the way he had left her so effortlessly, as if she and their child had been nothing more than burdens to shed. David's testimony was filled with calculated remorse, but Maria could see through it. It was the same smooth-talking facade he had used when they were married, the one that had convinced her he cared until he no longer did. As his lawyer finished the questioning, a hush settled over the room, and the prosecutor prepared to cross-examine. But before the prosecutor could ask the first question, Maria intervened, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. West," she said, addressing David directly, "you claim that you were unaware of the illegal activities within your company. Can you explain why certain financial documents bear your signature, authorizing the very transfers in question?" David blinked, visibly caught off guard. He stammered, trying to frame his answer, but the room could sense his unease. The prosecutor, sensing an opening, pounced on the discrepancy, turning the cross-examination into a trap that David could not escape. He fumbled through his explanations, But the evidence was clear. David had known exactly what he was doing, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. The trial dragged on for weeks, the details growing more damning as the prosecution presented a network of offshore accounts and shady business dealings, all traced back to David. Maria watched as the life David had built on lies and deceit unraveled before everyone's eyes. The man who had once seemed invincible was now a desperate figure, drowning in his own miscalculations. Yet Maria wasn't satisfied. She knew there was more at stake than just David's guilt or innocence. There was the question of justice for those he had hurt, including herself and Lucas. Her mind churned over the evidence late into the night, long after Lucas had gone to bed, seeking a way to hold David accountable for everything he had done. Then, one evening, as Maria sifted through the case files yet again, a piece of information caught her eye. It was a transfer, buried among hundreds of others, but this one stood out. The funds had been moved just days before David left her, draining their joint savings into an account under a different name. Maria felt her pulse quicken as she realized the implications. David had been siphoning money from their accounts long before he ever walked out the door. He hadn't just left her with nothing. He had planned it. The next morning, Maria called a recess, her face stern as she spoke to the attorneys. "I have a few questions about these transfers," she said, placing the documents on the bench. David's lawyer tried to object, but Maria's gavel came down hard. "Mr. West, you will answer my questions." David's expression shifted from confusion to panic as he recognized the figures. The courtroom watched in rapt silence as Maria pressed him on the details, revealing the trail of money that led directly to David's private account. It became clear that his departure had been more than a spontaneous decision. It was a calculated escape plan, one that left Maria and Lucas to fend for themselves while he safeguarded his wealth. When the recess ended, the courtroom buzzed with whispers, the realization sinking in that David's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had thought. He had not only abandoned his family but had stolen from them as well, ensuring that they would suffer while he continued his life without them. David's lawyer scrambled to counter the new evidence, but the damage was done. The jury watched David with fresh contempt, and Maria could see the change in their eyes. She knew that they would find him guilty of the charges, but the revelation also brought something else to the surface, a choice she had to make. That evening, Maria sat in her chambers, staring out of the window as the city lights twinkled below. She thought of all the nights she had stared at the same lights from her tiny apartment, wondering how she would survive the next day. Now, she had the power to bring David to his knees, to make him pay for every moment of suffering he had caused her and Lucas. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she wondered if vengeance was truly what she wanted. Lucas had grown into a bright, kind boy, unaware of the depths of his father's betrayal. Maria had always tried to shield him from the bitterness of the past, building a future where they could thrive despite everything. Was she willing to sacrifice that peace now for a moment of retribution? The next morning, Maria made her decision. She took her place on the bench, feeling the weight of the gavel in her hand as David's defense prepared their closing arguments. But before they could begin, Maria interrupted. "There is one more matter to address before we proceed with closing statements," she announced. "Mr. West, this court has uncovered evidence that you illegally transferred funds from a joint account with your former spouse. As a result, a new set of charges will be filed against you." David's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to protest. Maria's expression remained firm. "You will have the opportunity to face these charges in a separate trial, but for now, you will answer for the crimes you have committed against this state." She paused, her gaze locking with David's. "And for the damage you inflicted on those who trusted you." With those words, Maria felt a quiet resolution settle over her. She had chosen to let the law take its course, but in doing so, she had found a different kind of victory, a victory that went beyond personal vengeance. David would face justice, and this time there would be no escape. As the courtroom proceedings resumed, the air felt thick with anticipation. Word of the new charges against David had spread like wildfire, drawing more attention to the case. The gallery was packed with reporters, onlookers, and even former business associates who had come to witness the fall of a once powerful man. But for Maria, this wasn't about the spectacle. It was about closure, a chance to finally put the past to rest. David's lawyer delivered a frantic closing statement, appealing for leniency and insisting that his client's actions were the result of poor judgment rather than malice. He portrayed David as a man who had lost his way, trying to gain the jury's sympathy by emphasizing his recent struggles. But the evidence was clear, and Maria's questioning had exposed the truth. It was David himself who had orchestrated his downfall long before he ever stepped into her courtroom. When the prosecution gave its final arguments, they painted a vivid picture of a man who had manipulated those around him for his own gain, leaving behind a trail of ruined lives. They spoke of the families who had suffered because of David's schemes, and the many people he had hurt. Yet, as they spoke, Maria knew there was one person whose story remained untold, the woman and child he had abandoned a decade ago. When it was time for the jury's deliberation, Maria called a recess. David's face was ashen as he left the courtroom, escorted by guards, his lawyer trailing behind with a tense expression. Maria watched them go, the echoes of their footsteps lingering as she retreated to her chambers, where she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Lucas called her during the break, asking how things were going. His voice was full of the easy warmth that always softened her heart. He didn't know the full story, only that his father was in trouble and that Maria was the judge. "Will he go to jail?" he asked with childlike curiosity, unaware of the deeper currents beneath the case. Maria hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "That's for the jury to decide, honey. But remember, sometimes people make mistakes, and they have to face the consequences of those choices." Lucas accepted her answer, and as they ended the call, Maria felt a renewed sense of clarity. This wasn't just about David. It was about teaching Lucas what justice meant, about showing him that they could rise above the darkness of their past. Maria straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever would come next. After several hours, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. David stood beside his lawyer, his face a mask of nerves, sweat glistening on his brow. He glanced at Maria, perhaps hoping for a sign of mercy, but all he saw was her steady gaze, unreadable and resolute. "On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant, David West, guilty," the foreman declared. A murmur swept through the room as the verdict was read. "On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The finality of the words hit David like a blow, and he swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the defense table for support. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but David shrugged it off, his face contorting with anger and disbelief. Maria remained composed, but inside, a wave of emotions crashed through her. Relief, vindication, and a sense of justice that she had waited so long to see. But she knew her role wasn't over yet. Rising from her seat, she addressed the courtroom. "Mr. West," she began, her voice carrying through the silent room, "the court has found you guilty of serious crimes. Your actions have caused harm not only to your business associates but to those who once trusted you implicitly." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "It is the duty of this court to hold you accountable, and today, that duty has been fulfilled." David's eyes burned with resentment as he stared up at her, his mask of remorse slipping to reveal the bitterness beneath. "You think you're better than me, don't you, Maria?" he spat, his voice barely above a whisper but loud enough to reach her ears. "You've always been so self-righteous." Maria met his gaze without flinching. "This isn't about being better, David. It's about justice, something you never believed in until it came for you." With that, she brought down the gavel, sentencing him to the maximum penalty allowed by law, 10 years in prison, with restitution to be paid to those he defrauded. As the courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and whispers, David's face twisted with fury, but he knew he could not appeal to her for mercy. The decision was final. The guards moved to escort David out, but as he passed Maria's bench, he paused, turning to face her one last time. "You think you've won, don't you? You think this makes up for everything?" Maria stared at him, her expression softened by a strange sense of pity. "No, David. This isn't about winning. It's about finally moving on." She turned away, signaling the guards to take him away, and as he disappeared through the courtroom doors, she felt a burden lift from her shoulders, the weight of a decade's worth of pain finally starting to ease. But the story didn't end with David's sentencing. As Maria stepped down from the bench, her colleagues congratulated her, but she barely heard their words. Her thoughts were elsewhere. On Lucas, on the future they had built together, and on the lesson she had learned through this ordeal. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about making peace with the past, and ensuring that those who caused harm faced the consequences of their choices. A week later, as Maria returned home from work, she found Lucas waiting for her with a smile. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his eyes serious but bright with anticipation. Maria sat down beside him, curious and a little apprehensive. "What is it, sweetie?" Lucas hesitated, then handed her a letter, an old, creased envelope that looked like it had been hidden away for years. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she recognized David's handwriting scrawled across the front. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In an old box in the attic," Lucas replied. "It's from when I was born. I thought you might want to see it." Maria opened the letter with trembling hands, reading David's words written all those years ago. It was a letter he had written just before he left her, detailing his fears and insecurities, his struggles with the pressures of fatherhood that he never had the courage to voice. He admitted that he had felt inadequate and trapped, running away because he thought he would ruin everything if he stayed. But the final lines struck Maria the hardest. "If you ever read this, I hope you'll understand that I did what I thought was best, even though I know I was wrong. Maybe one day, I'll have the courage to face you again, to ask for forgiveness. But I doubt I'll ever deserve it." Maria let out a long breath, the letter trembling in her hands. She felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow, but also a sense of clarity. David had made terrible choices that had hurt her and Lucas deeply, but he had been running from his own demons all along. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it gave her a glimpse of the man he had once tried to be. That night, as she put Lucas to bed, Maria sat by his side, brushing a lock of hair from his face. "You know, Lucas," she said softly, "sometimes people make mistakes because they're afraid. But what matters is that we learn from them and try to do better." Lucas looked up at her with wide eyes. "Does that mean Dad's going to get better?" Maria paused, thinking of the man she had seen in court, broken and bitter. "I don't know, sweetie. But what I do know is that you and I will be okay, no matter what happens." And as Maria left Lucas's room, she felt a quiet peace settle within her, a peace that came from knowing that she had faced her past, not with vengeance, but with the strength to rise above it. David's story would continue behind prison bars, but hers was just beginning, a story of resilience, of love, and of the quiet victories that came from choosing compassion over hate. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.